devoted to changing the tide. Thank you, Matt. To turning the tide of the overdose crisis. So we are supported by funding from the Community Action Initiative to think about solutions for our community in South Surrey White Rock and beyond. So we're involved in a number of initiatives that are intended to reduce the incidence of overdose in our community and also to promote the well-being of people who use substances. A large part of that is in working with our boundary partners, people who have much more interaction with this population than we ever will. So we recognize that we are 5 years into BC having declared a public health emergency. As we know, this is the public health emergency that has claimed more lives than COVID in the last year, and over 7,000 British Columbians since it was first declared. We are aware that it is together, by sharing a perspective and sharing a compassion and understanding of the people we're serving, and considering ways that we can respond to this crisis together, that we're going to make much more of a difference to change this horrendous toll that is taking on our society. I do want to also acknowledge that we are conducting this webinar. I am conducting this webinar on the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, and for me in particular, the Semiahmoo First Nations. To take a moment for everyone to reflect on that this overdose crisis has disproportionately claimed the lives of Indigenous peoples, much more than any other group proportionally. So I want to invite some reflection on that. So the format that we have today is we're very lucky to have with us some people with lived and living experience, and Dr. Sharon Vipler, who is wonderful to have her here. But I do want to first allow Tricia Gillies to just share a few words. Thank you very much, Tricia. You're a member of our community action team and have been representing the paramedics wonderfully for these last few years. If there's something you'd like to say to your fellow first responders.
I just want to thank you, the CAT committee, for letting us be heard and letting us participate in this. And thank the paramedics that did send in questions. I'm hoping that we can build on this and make it a better presentation so that we can better serve this group of customers.
Thank you, Tricia. And, I just want to acknowledge the wonderful role that she has played and others have played in our community action team. And I'd like to check in with Ed, if you're there, Ed. Ed Wolf, if you might like to just speak to your fellow firefighters.
Yes, good afternoon. How are you? How are you doing today? Awesome. Well, thanks for organizing this once again. I think it'll be beneficial to all, as we discussed in earlier meetings. This is an area that we need to focus on in order for first responders to fully understand and assist in the efforts here. I look forward to the training today, and I'm glad it's being recorded. We're going to put it into our training curriculum for both auxiliary and career staff, and we'll make sure that it gets to all those employed by the City of White Rock. Thank you.
And thank you for that, Ed, and that commitment. Our hope is that what we share here will benefit, all of our residents. And I know we've got Mark Giffian here from the Surrey Fire, if you'd like to say anything, Mark.
Thank you very much. I appreciate seeing everybody together. I think I'm here to listen and potentially to share some interesting experiences related to our second responder program, if the group is interested at the end. So we have some good stories to share there. Thanks.
That would be great. Yes, thank you, Mark. So in reflecting on this talk, so my name is George Passmore. I'm the Director of Personal and Family Counseling and Support here at a place called Sources Community Resources. We're a pretty large multi-service organization, but in particular, I've managed the substance use services for the last 11 years and a co-chair of the community action team here on overdose prevention. And you know, I've lost people that I care about deeply to overdose, and I have seen people, you know, go through the struggle of opioid use and other substance use for a long time, for over 20 years. And there's a lens that I have for it now that I didn't have for it before, and it's from getting to know people like the ones who are going to share with us today, that I've come to have a much more of a capacity for empathy, compassion, and thinking about what role I can play to support people in, you know, living lives of distinction and worth. And this is a group that tends to experience a lot of marginalization and stigma and shame. And there's ways we can all participate to make the world more engaging and supportive, and a place where people can have connection and opportunities. So I'm really grateful to introduce the people who are going to be sharing here today. And I just want to briefly call them out first and before they share their stories. So we have Jacob Schwingboth. Say hi, Jacob.
Hey, everyone. Thank you.
And Daniel Snyder.
Good afternoon. Hello. Good to be here.
And Daniel is also the project coordinator for the Langley Cat. And Andrew McLeod. Where are you, Andrew?
Hi. Thanks for having me.
And we're also very blessed to have with us the lead physician for addiction medicine in Fraser Health, Dr. Sharon Bippler. If you want to say hi, Sharon.
Hi, everyone.
So that will be our panel today. And grateful to Tricia for gathering questions. We'll have time at the end for a Q&A period. And for those of you who are here, please feel free to use the chat to throw out any questions that are coming up along the way. And there will be time to ask some questions live. I do want to, before sharing stories, I want to recognize that our overdose crisis would be much more tragic if it weren't for the role that you folks have been playing. I happened to be up at my private practice in Uptown White Rock a couple weeks ago when I heard a bunch of sirens, and I looked out to see somebody down on the pavement on the sidewalk, and a young man standing next to him. So thankfully, the Good Samaritan law allowed this person to make a call with a sense of safety. And police were first there and attended to this young man. Fire was not long behind, and they were, you know, assisting that person. And it was not more than a minute after that that the paramedics showed up. They worked on him for a good 5 minutes, and it was beautiful to see this person come up, talk to the first responders there, and choose to get into the EMS vehicle, and was willing to go to Peace Arch Hospital. And then, like you guys, from there, who knows, right? But this person was able to stay in life thanks to who you all are and the dedication that you have, you know, to keeping people and to giving them that opportunity to see another day. So it's with appreciation that we're having this conversation today, and also hoping that the stories that are shared can add and deepen every interaction that you have with folks who are experiencing substance use issues. So now we start with Jacob's story. And Jacob, I've known Jacob for some years. And for you to share with folks your sense of how it is that you came to have a relationship with substances in the first place. What was it giving you? And then maybe take us through your journey with that and to where you are today.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you so much, you guys, for doing this. I really appreciate it from someone who's survived an overdose. So thank you. So for me, like, how did I get into drugs? I mean, to give a little bit of background, I'm a little bit type A in a way. And so coming out of a school, I was really into sports. And I started an athletic career in cycling. And so right out of high school, I ended up winning a national championships, which then sent me off to the world championships, where I placed the top 10. And from there, I joined the men's national team, and I ended up traveling the world, and I raced a professional cycling career on the road. And I was really connected to that drive, or that sense of, you know, that feeling that I get when I'm working towards a goal. And my addiction, what really happened, where it kind of started for me was in the off seasons. So I'd come back from this tour in Europe, and then I'd be sitting at home, and I didn't have that fulfillment. So in the off season, I started to use hard drugs like cocaine. And from there, I noticed, like, wow, this is something else. And things really started to snowball and escalate quite rapidly, probably from the first time I tried using stimulants. I would say within 3 months, I ended up in the hospital. And when I went to the hospital, it wasn't for an overdose, but when I was there, I was treated a little bit differently than when I had been in the hospital previously, let's say for a cycling accident. Like, I'd broken my collarbone, and I was treated with the most respect. So the first time I entered the hospital, I just had this bad experience with drugs, and I'm really scared. And the nurse is telling me, you know, there is worse problems out there for you to have. There's people in Africa right now that are starving, and this really shouldn't be a problem for you. And I just remember that dejected kind of loneliness feeling after just feeling so alone for, you know, a good 2-3 months of using. And from there, I went to treatment for the first time. And I say to people, the first time I went to treatment, I went in with a bachelor's in how to use drugs, and I left with a master's in how to use drugs. And from there, I heard all the stories on how to use drugs the real way. So I came back out, I held on to some recovery. I continued on with my cycling career. I ended up signing another contract, and I was racing over in Europe. And then things started to get away from me again. And it slowly, piece by piece, I would say, disintegrated, you know, the things that I had worked for my whole life, until the point where I had to kind of give up my career, my childhood dream of pursuing this this venture. And I ended up losing everything. And that was because I started to use intravenous meth and fentanyl. And that was the substances that really pulled me apart. So coming out of, you know, finishing up what I had a career, this feeling of just success and drive, and, you know, people looking to me like I'm a, you know, contributing member of society. I had respect and kind of privilege that I enjoyed with that. To completely have that decimated with an addiction. Now I'm, you know, let's say 2 months outside of my career, I've hung everything up, and my addiction, then it got really serious. And then from there, it was, you know, all day, every day drug use, where I'm commuting to Safe Point, for the harm reduction site, probably about 3 or 4 times a week to, you know, test my drugs, make sure that I'm not going to die in the middle of the night. And when I was at Safe Point, I ended up having an overdose. And this was my first overdose. And I wake up and I can't believe what happened. And I just start crying. I was so happy that that somebody had saved my life. And yeah, and it was such, everyone there was so compassionate and so nice, and they treated me with so much respect. Everyone was crying. The nurses were crying. People in there were they're also crying. We're all just having this experience of like, oh my gosh, I'm so happy that I'm alive. And I'm deep in an addiction. So I timed out, it's about 40 minutes, and then I use again. I felt like I was so trapped in this addiction. I needed to use to just keep on saving face. I had this image of myself that I was like this engaging, connected person, and these drugs were giving that feeling for me, even though I didn't even notice that I had been completely alone for months, and I hadn't really been talking to anybody. And so I'm using, and now the issues are coming in where people are starting to notice that I'm looking sick. So I don't have the same access now to Safe Point. I live in South Surrey. So now I'm starting to use alone. And so one night, in the middle of the night, I went and I scored, and I picked up, and I had an overdose. And I was living in my parents' basement at the time, and they were meant to be gone for the weekend, and something told them to come home, and my parents ended up finding me, and I was not breathing at the time, and my mom had to give me CPR, and they called 911, and people came to me, and I was told, my dad tells me, that I was treated with the most respect. That's that there was a lot of compassion, and people were really nice. And so I kind of wake up in the hospital, and it's a terrible feeling. No idea where I am. I can't hear anything. I don't know if but I was deaf, and I'm missing hair on the side of my head because I was leaned against the couch for so long. And actually the worst part about the hospital was waking up, because completely painful. I couldn't breathe. My lungs felt like they're filled with water. They're putting a catheter in to flush my kidneys out because those are failing. And then the Narcan was probably the most painful. It was like needles and daggers and pain just driving right through my body. And that was, an eye-opening experience, but it wasn't the one that really kind of got me clean. I ended up using maybe 2 or 3 weeks later. And the reason I think why it's so hard to explain the hopeless feeling, it felt like there was no other way. There was nothing else I could do to feel like I could be successful in my life. And from there, I ended up going to another treatment center, which had a little bit different protocol. I went to Pacifica. There's a little bit of freedom in there, and there's a kind of a different environment where, yeah, it was just, I guess I could say different. And, from there, things were not perfect. Coming back, the hardest part about the recovery part was I started when I was 20, literally trying to not do drugs up till now I'm 25, 26. And it's just so much failure to be dealing with. It's just unbelievable, the feeling of despair, thinking that it is impossible. And really what it came down to was, I'm talking about hundreds of hours of therapy. I'm talking about years of therapy. If you put it all back to back, it's probably a year straight of therapy. And we're talking meetings, and we're smart meetings and AA meetings, and meeting with George, and meeting with EMDR, and using cannabis, and I'm literally doing everything I can. And eventually things are building up where I can come to the conclusion that I don't need it. And I'm getting to that point. And now about, I guess now we're talking like 3 years ago. And once it started to click, my life changed within 6 months. So basically from that overdose experience, probably 6 more months of using, 1 year after that, I was teaching spin classes. I was full vitality. I was health. I was living my best life. And I feel like it wasn't one experience that really changed my mind, that really helped me out. It was the longevity of all the help and all the thinking that I had to change about myself, the core beliefs, that eventually I came to the conclusion that there is something else out there. Today, it is undeniable. I have energy for my life. I just bought a house. I have a job. People trust me. I call my dad every day. I am alive. And I'm just really happy to be alive today. And that's my story.
Wow. Thank you, Jacob. That's beautiful. And yeah, man, I'm glad you're here. And I was privileged to be a part of that journey, a small part of that journey, but it's very meaningful. And you're so right. It can feel like such a trap of despair that it's almost impossible to see through it, to see the hope. Right. But now, being where you're at, looking back, right?
Yeah.
It was worth just being able to hang on and stay willing. And, I know you wanted to say something specifically to the first responders here about that, right? Around, you having the chance to be living this life today. So what did you want to say to the first responders?
Well, I really, from the bottom of my heart, you guys, just thank you so much. It's changed not just my life, but everyone in my life. I'm alive today, and I get to give back to society. I get to help people through their lives. I get to have this unbelievable sense of gratitude from having a near-death experience. Nothing is going to get me down because I'm just so happy to be alive, and I couldn't have been in this place really without people coming and saving my life. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Jacob. And I was sharing to these guys earlier that the average first responder probably doesn't get to hear that, right? You have these brief interactions and don't know like how that gratitude can live on in a person's heart. So appreciate you got that chance to share that just now, Jacob. And also the ripple effect it has. It's not just you that benefits, it's all the people around you and what you get to give to the world.
Right.
Thank you, Jacob.
Thank you.
All right. So Daniel, same thing to you. What would you like to share with the group here? Hard to follow that, I know.
I was going to say there's a little challenge here ahead of me. Follow Jacob's passion. That's fantastic. It's such an encouraging story. And I know that when we hear these stories, we can pick out themes that are familiar to me in my own experiences, and I hear other people's stories. And I relate to a number of elements of what Jacob shared. Also, I'm an overdose survivor. His isolation and disconnection, and then the fact that there was people in his life that created judgment-free, shame-free opportunities when they could to connect with him, regardless of circumstances, in the midst of an overdose, saving his life, not piling on judgment, not compounding the shame that already likely existed in his heart in that moment. And my own journey, I grew up in a very sheltered, conservative Christian family. Drugs were not something I was exposed to or aware of. I had a great childhood in that sense, very naive, really. And I think the extent of my comprehension of drugs were they fry your brain like an egg in a frying pan. When you do drugs, your brain will be scrambled, and then your life is destroyed forever. That was the world I grew up in. And in my late teens and all these life experiences that we have, and some of which certainly upon reflection I would have considered to be traumatic experiences, the opportunity to experiment with drugs came my way, and I did so, and my brain was not fried immediately. Not the next day. I was fine. Actually, I woke up feeling great, and the drugs were a lot of fun.
Yeah, it immediately puts the lie to what the adults have always said to the kids, right? It's like, don't do drugs, they're terrible. You'll do that, you'll feel this, yeah, it's like, all messages, goodbye.
Yeah, and actually that was more significant than I really even probably realized. Just the environment that I'd grown up in, I really came from this perspective of, well, adults, parents, authority figures want the best for me, and their motivations are pure. They're telling me the truth about the world, and they're telling me the truth about drugs, and they're telling me the truth about God and all this stuff. And then, a few things happen in a person's life, and it's like, oh, well, were they lying to me? Do they not know what they're actually talking about? And so, one thing I always like to say is drugs are great. I mean, they nearly killed me. They nearly ruined my life completely, but that doesn't take away from the fact that drugs are good and they're fun and people enjoy them. And most people do so responsibly and don't end up becoming addicted like I did, or going bankrupt like I did, or nearly ending up divorced like I thankfully did not. My wife stood by my side despite years and years of addiction. Heroin was my drug of choice, and I overdosed prior to the fentanyl overdose crisis, prior to fentanyl being introduced into the drug supply. And I think I'm very well aware that I would not be alive today had I continued using during this last 5 years, where the overdose rates have skyrocketed so dramatically, where we went from this 4% of fentanyl detected in 4% of overdoses in 2012 to 87% in 2018. And so I'm just very acutely aware that I got another chance at life. I actually had just a strange experience with recovery and my journey. And I don't know that it was actually all that unusual. One thing I always say about it is that my recovery journey was essentially defined by relapse for a very long period of time. So I had family and friends around me, and it was constant. Like, I would have seasons of doing well or seasons of sobriety, which was my goal. And then the bottom would fall out and there would be a relapse, and people would come around me and tell me that I needed to get my act together and change this and change that and become sober again. And a lot of that was helpful and a lot of it wasn't. I went to a lot of treatment centers. A lot of it was helpful. A lot of it wasn't. I went to detoxes, helpful sometimes, not always. The difference, the key between what was helpful and what wasn't was the individuals that were there, the people that made time to connect with me along the lines of what I started this in sharing: judgment-free, free of demands, free of reinforcing shame narratives. And we do that in our culture. We don't even really consciously think about it. When it comes to addiction, when it comes to substance use, we expect people to act a certain way. And there's a lot of hypocrisy in it, because we'll be sitting there with our glass of wine telling people that they shouldn't smoke weed. Or we have this stigma hierarchy that we assign to certain substances, but not other substances. We treat everything differently, and it's kind of weird. It doesn't make sense to me. We say alcohol and drugs, like alcohol is not a drug. Like we got to treat it in some special category. It's the good drug,
Yeah. I'll add that we know alcohol causes more harms in our society than all the illicit drugs put together.
It's true.
Yeah,
Yeah,
when you add
it's
it all
very
up.
true.
Yeah.
And so I've just realized in my own journey that that's exactly what this is for all of us, is a journey. I had a lot of relapse, and I had a friend of mine who said to me one time after a relapse, well, why'd that happen? Why do you think you relapsed again? And I looked at him and I actually thought about it, and I had no answer. And he said something pretty obvious, but quite profound. Until you can answer that question, you'll probably keep repeating this cycle. And that was a moment of change for me. That was a moment of awareness. That was a moment of realizing, yeah, I need to dig. I need to find what's underneath this. And that's where, Gabor Mate's famous line, it's not about the addiction. It's not why the addiction. It's why the pain. What was underneath it? What was drugs, like I said from the very beginning, were great. I really enjoyed them. I enjoyed what they did for me. They made me feel capable. They made me feel confident. They made me feel that I was able to, they made me feel normal. They provided a sense of relief. They were a social lubricant, all those things. And so I felt more capable. I felt better when I was high. And I was also a person who had the means to access drugs without resorting to criminal activity. So I maintained employment, I maintained housing. I was always, with vehicle, and most of the people in my life had no idea about the addiction that I was struggling with. I was able to do a very good job at hiding it. And that motivation to hide it was driven by a strong awareness that if people really knew what was really going on with me, they would just write me off. I'd be discredited in their eyes. I saw how my peers and coworkers treated homeless people or treated people that looked a certain way. And so I put a lot of effort into not looking that way, to try and still do my hair on a daily basis. And so it was all an act. It was all, I suppose. And that kept me really in. Perfect. And then I moved out, and I had a friend that also had the same name as me. His name is Daniel. And he was going to move into this room I just moved out of. And him and I had so much in common. We were both painting contractors. We both just left treatment. He was well liked in the community. His addiction struggle was very similar to mine, hidden. If you looked at him, if you walked past him on the street, you have no idea what he was struggling with. You'd have no way of stereotyping him. And he rented that basement suite after me, and I reintegrated into my family. 2 weeks later, he was found dead in that basement suite, overdosed, alone. Not seeking opioids. He was seeking cocaine that happened to be contaminated by fentanyl, because that's what's happening in the midst of this drug supply crisis. And, I realized how easily that could have been me. And, I'm grateful to be alive. I'm grateful for the opportunities of the people that connected with me and saw something in me. They called potential out of me. They said, when your kid and your dad says you have potential, it's like an insult in a way. I know they mean it as a compliment. They're like, oh, there's so much great stuff inside of you, and one day it's going to develop and grow out of you. But I was, what they're really saying,
you don't have it.
yeah, what they're really saying is, but it's not there yet,
Yeah.
But people never gave up on me. They always said there's potential within you. And I see that in the people that I connect with today, in the people that I meet that are struggling, in the people that I that I connect with that live on the street, that are homeless, that don't have jobs right now, that are struggling, or those friends of mine that I know that are in the midst of their addiction but still work every day and are still married and still pay their bills and still function. But that there's more than just where they're at. And that people kept calling that out of me. They kept saying that to me. And for that reason, and that reason alone, I'm still here. So yeah, thanks for letting me share.
Thanks so much, Daniel. That's phenomenal. You really, I guess, bring a window into that compassion for how a person starts a relationship that initially is providing something good, something you actually need in your life. It just happens to be showing up in that way at that time. So, and then how it took on a life of itself. So there's that compassion for the past journey that brought you there, but you're also talking about the compassion of possibility.
Yeah.
So that as any
absolutely.
first responder is interacting with someone, they can see what could be possible for this person. I'm seeing them at this low point, this dire point. What's possible for this human being, right? It's another version of compassion. Yeah. Thank you. So, Andrew, I'd like to provide you with your opportunity to share with these folks what would be meaningful for you.
All right, I'll try and take you through some important points in my life, just little snapshots. So I was introduced to the concept of drugs with the DARE program when I was in grade 5, which happened to be 2005 to 2006. And I was completely opposed to ever even smoking a joint or anything beyond that, for sure. And then in grade 6, I was diagnosed with depression. And the next year, my dad was diagnosed with cancer. So he's up there. And he passed away April 3rd, 2009. And that kind of made the depression so much worse. I mean, I've been through a lot. Nothing can really compare to that year and how awful it was. And it was my next birthday the following February in 2010 that I tried cannabis under months and months of intense peer pressure. And within a year, it was cocaine. Within 6 months after that, it was meth and heroin was my drug of choice. And 2013 is when it was really bad, daily using. I was in detox, I was in treatment. None of that really worked. And it was September that I was introduced to Suboxone by a former drug dealer who had been on it. And that helped me a lot to get off of heroin at that time. And I relapsed several times throughout the years. And I stayed away from local news. I kind of was disconnected from anybody who had used. They passed away or I just didn't talk to them. And in November 2017, I relapsed again. And this time it was fentanyl. And I didn't really know at the time. I just thought I have no tolerance and this is very strong stuff. But January 3rd, I kind of had an overdose, was woken up by my mom actually, and the paramedics came. I couldn't really hear as well. And when I got out of the hospital about 7 days later, I went right back to it, just thinking I could get away with it. Then had another close call, and my eye went really wonky, and there's a possibility of losing sight in one eye for the rest of my life. So that scared me away for a couple of years. And it was November, I'm just putting in the chat, Aaron Hinks of Peace Arch News has done a better job than I probably will of recounting what happened, but I overdosed the morning of November 19th, and Ed Wolf's firefighters found me in my room. I used the lifeguard app, and they dragged me out into the hallway, and I woke up after some CPR and didn't really know what was going on, but I quickly realized I had overdosed. And that was after, the pandemic and some chronic knee pain had had brought me back to fentanyl. And then again in, I believe it was January of this year, overdosed again. And a couple weeks later, I got on Suboxone for the second time, and I stayed on that and relapsed a couple times. But yeah, Suboxone has really helped me. I would encourage any first responders to recommend that to someone they have revived.
Andrew, what is Suboxone? How does it work for you? In what way does it help, do you find?
Yeah, so well, I got on it in February, and immediately all my withdrawals were gone, which were pretty severe, and the cravings quickly disappeared as well. And those are the two of the main features of it. Another one is if you use, which some people can get away with, if you use fentanyl or whatever while you're on Suboxone, the risk is dramatically reduced of overdosing. I think George said that there's nobody out of the 7,000 plus that were on Suboxone when they overdosed and died from using fentanyl.
Right.
So,
Yes. No. None of the 7,000 BC residents who died were on Suboxone, apparently. So, yeah, it's got a protective factor there.
yeah, kind of a safety net. But I'll leave it at that. My mom wanted to say a few words, and I just want to thank all the first responders that were there on those days. Thanks for saving my life. I'm really grateful for that. I'll just give it over.
Hi, everybody. I'm Aileen McLeod, Andrew's mom. It's very emotional being here and listening to your stories are very emotional indeed. I'm not sure what all I want to say. I thought I'd tell you just a little bit about who Andrew is. As you can imagine, he's a wonderful son. He's a caring, kind, compassionate, sensitive person, and he's grown up in a very loving home. In fact, his grandparents lived downstairs here till 2012, and we have a lot to thank the firefighters for. I don't know how many times, seriously, they were here, and I would run over there in the middle of the night because someone had fallen, and they were always so kind and great towards us. So we really, really appreciate. We lived right across the street from the fire hall, so it was really awesome. It's been a very bumpy road. It's terrifying being the mother of someone using drugs. It's been really, really terrifying, and it's absolutely terrifying to hear the footsteps of the paramedics, first responders coming down the hallway and having no clue, what's going on. But I can't imagine doing that job every day. I'm just so glad that you do it so well, stay so focused, so calm, very compassionate. And thank you so very much for being there for my son. Unfortunately, more than once you've had to come, and I hope I never see you again at our doorstep. I hope not. Yeah, so we're very, very grateful in this house to all the first responders, and I want you to know this is a life definitely worth saving, as George has said many times. Yeah, I hope that Andrew has a long and healthy life and can beat this for good. So thanks for listening.
Thanks, Eileen, and thank you, Andrew, very much. Yeah, and as you know, I'm a big fan of Andrew. I think he's just a wonderful human being. So I'm glad that you can express your gratitude and also share that it's a local resident right across the street that is living today in a better way because of their efforts. Yeah.
Sorry, you asked me one question there. What did heroin give you initially that bonded you to it? It was just pain relief from the harsh depression and anxiety of losing my dad and everything before that and after. Just the best possible pain relief, I guess, that I could get my hands on.
if you could describe, like, because I think the average person who hasn't used before, they might not have an appreciation for like what a cocoon of well-being it provides temporarily.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So essentially, when you start using it, I only really smoked it. You just kind of forget about everything else that's going on, and that becomes your focus, and you're focused on a really nice, positive feeling, and all the kind of horrible stuff in the world just kind of fades into the background. And yeah, it's I assume that's why a huge percentage of people use it.
Absolutely.
You know, George, apparently there was some studies, brain imaging on, a brain of an individual who takes heroin lights up the same part of the brain that an individual would have lit up when they are receiving a hug, a long, prolonged hug from a person that they love. And I've always felt that that's a very accurate way of comprehending heroin. It's a warm hug. And so, when there's physical pain, which it does a fantastic job at dealing with physical pain, it also does an equally as good job at helping you with emotional pain. It's very comforting. Yeah, little snapshot there, what it's like.
And that can be especially reinforcing for those folks who maybe have not had that in their lives, or have had a start to life that has been very unpredictable, tumultuous, scary. And as Andrew was saying, even in homes where there was a lot of that nurturing and love and connection, but all it takes is for somebody to go through something where the pain is now present. Or it's this cosmic hug, this warm hug is providing this cocoon of bliss and well-being that otherwise they're not able to access. Certainly not in that way. And then, of course, the lie of the opioid is when you come down from that feeling's gone. You're back facing what you're facing. Plus, over time, the withdrawal, which is the opposite of the main effect. Yeah, and that's the trap. Yeah. So to give another perspective to this, and I want to thank the people with lived experience, Jacob, Daniel, Andrew, for sharing their stories so openly and so courageously. Yeah, it's like a shot to my heart, actually. So I want to give Dr. Vipler an opportunity to bring another perspective that I think of all the physicians I've worked with, Dr. Vipler's got a way of bringing a window of understanding into something like opioids and substance use that is just full of compassionate spirit. So over to you, Dr. Vipler.
Oh, thank you. Those are some pretty big acts to follow. Given that our best teachers are actually, in fact, our patients and the people we're here to help along, as Daniel said, the journey. I have to say, I grew up watching the same commercial that Daniel did. This is your brain on drugs. Turns out that's not true. I really want to go to the spin class that Jacob's teaching. Sign me up.
It'd be like a bolt of a lightning bolt of energy.
It sounds fantastic. And Andrew and Eileen, thank you so much for being here and speaking so candidly and so close to a time that you've had periods of instability and recent overdoses. I find that's actually quite unique, that we often engage people once they're quite well. And so for you to be here and share with us your vulnerability takes levels of courage and bravery that just don't know if I could ever wrap my head around. So amazing. I'm going to be super nerdy, and as is fitting, I suppose, when you're a doctor. And I put together a PowerPoint, so I'm just going to
bring it on. We like the intellectual stuff too, Dr. Vipler. Bring it to us.
Probably more so because I'm nervous. I'm usually not nervous speaking to groups, but this is a slightly different group. And can you guys see, I have like two screens. So can you see my actual slideshow or do you see my notes screen?
It's the notes screen at the moment.
Let's see if we can swap that. How about now?
That's perfect.
Okay, great. So I decided to call this little presentation by the question that I actually get asked the most, both by random people that I meet that find out what I do, and also actually a lot by medical students and residents. And that question is, but how do you do that? Like, how do you do that work? And I'm hoping this is a little bit of a window into, we often refer to medicine as a combination of a science and an art. And the science piece is easy. So I'm hoping this is a window into the art. And before we begin, just a recognition of the land we occupy. I happen to live, work, and play and raise my family in the Fraser region. For me, that's predominantly in the Semiahmoo and Tsawwassen regions, but given my regional role, it is all of these listed regions. And this is me, or this is the nerdy version of me. So I'm a physician. I'm an addiction medicine physician. I'm a clinical assistant professor with the Department of Medicine at UBC. As George mentioned, I am the program medical director and department head for addiction medicine services in Fraser Health. I have no financial or commercial disclosures. So that means like I don't get any money from companies or drug companies or anything like that, and never ever have. I work clinically for Fraser Health, but also I work at St. Paul's, so that's Providence Health. And then I do teaching and consulting for the BCCSU, the BC Centre for Excellence for HIV and AIDS, and then some other health authorities. So PHSA, Vancouver Island, FNHA, and then randomly Eastern Health out in Newfoundland. And then I do some policy review with the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Mental Health and Addictions. So back to the question, how do you do this? And I thought I would start with the science part, actually. So we're going to actually talk a little bit about the brain. We're going to talk about this phrase of hijacking, how drugs hijack the brain, and how I interpret that phase and what we mean when we use that phrase. And then I'm going to share with you a little bit about withdrawal, because I think the very first aha moment I had in terms of why do people use actually occurred when I sat across from someone who was in acute withdrawal. So this is the brain. And I think this is as nerdy as it gets today, guys, so don't worry. And so this is the brain. This would be if you were to cut the brain through the middle, and you can see that it's got different areas labeled. So the part responsible for movement and sensations, et cetera, et cetera. Important for us in addiction medicine is the reward pathway that you see here, but also judgment, and really important actually is memory in when we use substances or when individuals use substances. And when we talk about hijacking, the brain is actually designed to release dopamine. So this is our feel-good neurotransmitter, release dopamine when we want it to keep doing something. So we're an animal species, just like any other animal. So we actually get a dopamine release when we eat, because it's important to eat to survive. And we also get a dopamine release when we engage in sexual activity, because in order to propagate a species, that's an act that we have to engage in. So food, you get about 150% of your baseline dopamine being released when you eat a food that you find particularly yummy. Sex is at about 200% basal increase. Opioids, it's about the same as sexual activity, so 200%, pardon me. Same with alcohol. Nicotine is actually more. So this slide made me think maybe I should try smoking cigarettes, but 225%. Cocaine is 350%. And for those of us who wonder why people use crystal methamphetamine, when you use amphetamines, it increases your dopamine percent release by over 1,000%. So that's what we mean when we say it hijacks. So this brain system where we have a reward for engaging in a certain activity and it results in the release of dopamine, that's there for survival, right? That's there because we need to have some kind of reward mechanisms to have us repeat activities that will help our species to survive. Turns out there are other ways to have dopamine release, and that's what we mean by hijacking. So that dopamine reward system gets hijacked by these substances. So I think a number of people already on the call have identified, I now realize I grew up quite privileged. Of course, like anyone else, I probably complained about my parents when I was a teenager, but I grew up kind of classic white picket fence, happy little life. And I didn't really get it. Like I heard about people who use drugs and I was like, why? And then, as I said, I, as a physician, sat across someone for the very first time who was going through withdrawal. And in this case, it was opioid withdrawal. And this individual was hunched over a garbage can, vomiting in between words, was shaking and sweating, wrapped in a blanket, complaining of being freezing cold, and was like dripping sweat off of his face. The individual was tremulous and clearly in the most amount of discomfort I have ever seen another human being. And I remember in that moment thinking, why wouldn't you use if it would stop this? So that's the other part of the brain that I think is really important to recognize. The brain recognizes withdrawal as danger. And our brains are actually hardwired to take us out of danger. So the part of your brain's use in the setting of pain as a consequence of withdrawal is the same part of your brain that pulls your hand back when you accidentally touch an element on your stove that's on. So you're doing that before you even realizing it. Like before you're even registering the pain, really, your brain's pulled your hand back, and then the pain hits. Or that part, I don't know if this has ever happened to someone where you go to step across the road and a car is coming really quickly and you manage to pull yourself back before you even register that you're about to get hit by a car. So it's that ancient part of your brain that drives survival. So if you're feeling the way that gentleman was that was sitting across from me, and your brain knows there is a way to decrease this discomfort and get your body out of quote unquote danger, it will drive you to use. And the way you get yourself out of danger when you're in withdrawal is to put opioids into your system and mitigate that withdrawal. And it truly was, it was a light bulb moment for me where I was like, oh, we need to stop using the word choice in this conversation. This is pure, basic, animalistic survival at that point. This is your brain driving you to essentially, as the brain sees it, save yourself. The other part that's important, and I'm going to go back to the brain diagram, is that when this memory piece that's involved in withdrawal and your basically brain is on fire when you're in withdrawal, this judgment piece, the part that allows you to like pay your taxes on time and pick up your kids after school or make quote unquote the right decision.
Actually, Sharon, my example for that is it's the part of you that knows how you feel after you eat McDonald's fries.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh dear,
Right?
hitting me with hurts.
Yeah.
But they're so good. Yeah, right. So that part, sorry. I'm a popular girl, guys. So that was just my phone, but absolutely, that's exactly it. The part that, like, in hindsight is like, maybe I should have gone to just a small fries and not a large fries. That part, when you're in that extreme of withdrawal, actually the brain won't allow it to function because it needs to focus on survival. So we know similar decisions are made in refugee camps and what have you, where when your brain is just focused on survival, judgment, that part of your brain, the neurons don't fire as often or in the same fashion. So again, time to take the word choice out of the conversation. Choice is a luxury. So that's me being confused. And then there was a question about what happens when someone comes to the hospital. And I have to say, I was being a little bit, I don't know what the word is, but when I saw that, I was like, what should happen when someone comes to the hospital, or what does happen when someone comes to the hospital? So what should happen is an individual arrives with what's known as a medical condition, and they're treated with the same kindness and respect as any individual that arrives with a medical condition. What does occur is what Jacob described. And sometimes it's subtle, and sometimes it's not subtle. And for individuals that are coming into the hospital because they've just lost their life, you can imagine how that stigma would land, and what it might mean for whether or not an individual comes back for help. So in terms of medically what happens, depending on whether or not they've received Narcan in the field, they will be observed for a certain amount of time. That may vary depending on what other substances are on like in the patient. More and more now, we're having to observe patients longer because of the contamination with benzodiazepines. Once the patient kind of perks up and stays alert and is, looks like oxygenating well, patients are often released. So here in Fraser Health, we actually have a program called SUSAT, so Substance Use Services Access Team, that's been around for a few years now. And I think they've been a big game changer in what happens, in that they can help patients transition and connect to services in the community. Whereas before, it was a revolving door, like, yep, breathing, oriented, alert, well, maybe not even oriented, breathing, alert, off you go. So we're starting to expand what we think our responsibility is when patients come in. Then there was another question about treatment, and I think the question was worded as treatment or harm reduction. And I would like to take the opportunity to replace the word or and put in place the word and. Treatment is not exclusive of harm reduction. So harm reduction is an overarching principle that we will assist our patients to engage in strategies to keep them safe when they are using, if they are using, because, and I think it was Eileen Andrews' mom who said this, these are lives worth saving, with the implicit meaning being all lives are worth saving. Treatment, in my world, is pharmacological or psychosocial supports. In the world of opioid use disorder, a big part, particularly early on, is actually going to be pharmacological. And Andrew spoke to this very well when he mentioned Suboxone. The other two medications that you'll hear spoken of more regularly would be methadone and slow-release oral morphine or Cadian. And all of them kind of work in the same general way, in that most street opioids, heroin, fentanyl, other prescription opioids that people manage to get through purchased ways, are short-acting. And so what's happening is you're going through that up and down multiple times a day, and most pronounced with fentanyl, in fact. And so as people use and they manage to alleviate their withdrawal, their next thought is, How am I going to make sure I don't go into withdrawal again? So all day long, it's this cycle of let's get out of withdrawal, let's get out of withdrawal. The way methadone, Suboxone, and slow release oral morphine work is once you get those medications at an adequate dose, it settles that cycle. And these are medications that are opioids, partial or full opioids, and they are long acting. And that's the difference, is that when you get to a dose of this long acting opioid antagonist, and you'll hear that term used a lot in the world of addiction medicine, it basically sits in those receptors and essentially says to them, why don't you just calm down? Our opioid receptors are fine. We're not going to go into withdrawal. As mentioned by our speakers before, that initially you have the alleviation of withdrawal symptoms, and then it settles the craving, and then it kind of just moves into the background once you have those kind of physical pieces managed. What that will allow the patient to do is to do the rest of the work that's being described, the work of, I think it was Jacob who mentioned, a year of that counseling and the exploration and the self-reflection and identifying the triggers and what have you. You can't do that work when you're in withdrawal. You can't do that work if you're craving. So these are really things that go hand in hand. There is no silver bullet. There is no panacea. It is not so opiate agonist therapy, so methadone, Suboxone, Acadian, or harm reduction, or psychosocial supports and counseling. It is all of these things. When we have patients with diabetes, we don't say like, either I can teach you how to manage this disease with your diet, or I can give you oral diabetes medications, or I can give you insulin. We know that in many cases, people need all three. So here's the answer to the question that I posed in the beginning, how do you do this work? At least it was for me. And for me, it was getting an understanding or developing an understanding of trauma-informed practice. So the definition, or one of the definitions, is just being aware that trauma is a thing. It happens to people. It's recognizing that trauma has impact on physical, emotional, and mental health. And it may impact how people choose to engage with services or how they are capable of engaging with services. It's also recognizing that current services can re-traumatize individuals. And I will tell you that for me, I'm a helper, as I imagine the people on this call are. I like to help. I like for people to recognize that I like to help. I just want to make things better. And so when I first started in this area of work, and I would be doing it, let's say a consult in the emerge department, and I'd walk in and be super quirky and ready to save the day. And I would walk in as the addiction medicine specialist, and the patient would take one look at me, turn his or her head, and tell me to go F off. And I was just like, whoa. And I had seen colleagues in that spot get angry and lash back at the patient, but that's not really my thing. I just get hurt. I'm more like my feelings got hurt. Like, can't you see I'm just trying to help? And then the idea of trauma-informed practice really allowed me to understand that it had nothing to do with me. It had to do with the system. It had more to do with the stethoscope around my neck and what that represented than me. And to this day, when people say, how do you do this work? I tell them my mantra, and my mantra is, it's not about me. Sometimes people get a bit confused when we talk about trauma-informed care, and they start thinking about trauma services, like people who come in and actually provide very specific therapy for trauma. I don't do that. I'm not qualified to do that, not even close. Trauma-informed is just understanding that people may have had experiences in their life that change the way they experience the environment. So really quickly, I think because sometimes we oversimplify our ideas of trauma. There's single incident trauma, so unexpected, overwhelming events. There's the one that I think a lot of us think about, which is complex or repetitive trauma. So types of abuse, domestic violence, or war. There's developmental trauma. This one is less tangible, I think, or less overtly visible. So occurring during infancy, childhood, or adolescence. And again, can include physical, sexual, emotional abuse and neglect. And then there's historical trauma. And I think this is a really important one when we speak about the statistics that George shared around our First Nations communities experiencing a disproportionate ill effect of the overdose crisis. Clearly very timely following the news out of Kelowna. So this is massive group trauma, emotional wounding as a result that not only crosses lifespans, but crosses generations. So what does it look like if you're a trauma-informed group? So an organization or a system. So again, just recognizing that trauma is a thing. Recognizing what it might look like in patients. So the patient that told me to F off, was that defiance? Was that someone being mean, or was that trauma? That was most certainly trauma. And how it may present in different ways. And really thinking about how is your approach as a group or an organization, particularly when you're a helping organization, how does it systematically recognize and respond to trauma? And again, I actually put these slides together before the news came out of Kelowna, but this is particularly, I think, timely now. So this is St. Paul's Hospital in 1923. And I did my medical school training at St. Paul's Hospital. And I gotta tell you, I love that site. I feel smarter the minute I walk in. It is where I first it really resonated that being a doctor is what I was supposed to do. I learned a ton. Hospitals have always been a reasonable place for me. Nothing terrible has happened to me in a hospital. So when I think about St. Paul's Hospital, I think that it's just super great. So that's St. Paul's Hospital. And this is a residential school. So alarmingly similar architecture. This is actually Grey Nuns Hospital in Saskatchewan. And this is a residential school. So imagine you are an individual who has either been at a residential school or you are the child or a relative of an individual who has been in residential school, and what it would feel like to walk through those doors looking the way that they do. And I think one of the statistics that's shocked me the most, embarrassingly enough, is that the last residential school operated by the Canadian government was closed in 1996. I graduated high school in 1997. And if you had asked me in grade 11 if there were any residential schools still operational in Canada, I would have 100% been confident in saying, no way. So imagine my distress when I came across this statistic. And so I think one of the very first steps is having an awareness of what's occurred and where people may have experienced trauma and what that might look like now and potentially for a few generations. So I like this. Trauma-informed practice, it shifts the conversation from what is wrong with you. So, a patient I had 2 years ago now, roughly, was in a waiting room and became agitated and started throwing chairs around. And rather than the question being, what is wrong with you? The question shifts to what has happened to you. And in that patient's situation, it was just being in an institutionalized setting was exceedingly difficult. And that individual had actually hung on for the 20 minutes that they had been waiting in there, and they just couldn't handle it anymore. And so I imagine as helpers, as first responders, you probably do have moments of engagement that feel like they're coming out of left field when you base it on, like, you know, the 2 or 3 sentences or conversation that you've had with the patient, and recognizing, as I imagine you probably already do, that conversation started a long time before you showed up, or before we show up. And the other kind of soapbox I like to stand on any chance I get, so thanks, George, is the language that we use. And there's actually a lot of literature out there that shows that stigma results in individuals not seeking help. Stigma dehumanizes individuals, and when we dehumanize individuals, it makes it easier for us not to provide the same kind of care that we would for other individuals. So we really want to get away from using words like abuse or abuser, drug habit. I never use the word addict, so it's actually quite difficult for me to even say out loud, or drug user, because the messaging that we give when we use this language is that it's the patient's fault, it's their choice, that there isn't hope, and that they are in some way a criminal. And this speaks to, I think Daniel was mentioning how we have different feels around different substances. And in fact, that if alcohol tried to get a Health Canada exemption today, it would never pass. So, you know, just using neutral language instead of abuser or addict. Say this is an individual with a opioid use disorder or a substance use disorder, alcohol use disorder. It's just use disorder. Put whatever substance in front of it. Drug habit, you can just say regular substance use. And former reformed addict, really just looking at words like recovery, long-term recovery. And so people also like to ask me, after they ask me, how do you do this? They like to ask me, so, you know, what causes addiction? In 10 words or less. And depending on how cheeky I feel, you'll get a different answer. But I think, you know, we saw this in the three cases with our colleagues here who have lived experience, that it isn't just one thing. It's a little bit of everything, and a little bit more of one thing in some cases and a little bit less of other things in other cases. And so you never really know what the makeup is of the person in front of you who has substance use disorder. And just to treat, the easiest thing is just treat everyone well, and treat them how you'd hope your mom would be treated. Or if you have a difficult relationship with your mom, pick someone you like. So that's what I've got for you guys today in terms of like formal presentation, but I'm happy to answer questions now or even later, whatever George would like.
Thanks so much, Sharon. That's wonderful. Treat people as you would wish them to treat your mom. That one works for me. I know it doesn't work for anybody. Someone that you would really care to be treated with, like,
yeah,
kindness, the absolute kindness, in the way that both Andrew and Jacob particularly shared that they've had experience of that. It's funny because you know, with trauma-informed practice, it's just imagining that people have a lived history that seeing it's shaping how they may be interacting with us right now. And so we're history a lot of times. And then how we respond to that is between reactivity and social engagement, right? So it's even just those small things like eye contact, voice tone, body language, just things that convey safety, respect, and care. I'll never forget, so I'm gonna put in the chat, I did co-produce a video a few years back before the overdose crisis. It's on YouTube, and it features RCMP and Abbotsford Police and firefighters and paramedics and people lived experience. And one gentleman shared that what changed things for him is when he was in the ambulance, he remembers the woman holding his hand. He'd been stabbed, a drug deal gone wrong, and he thought he was going to die. And the look of the facial expression of the paramedic looking down on him was one of genuine care for him as a human being. And he'd been wearing this stigma that I'm, marginalized in society. I don't really have a place here. People look down at me, but not from this woman. And then when he was the most vulnerable, he got a human response that said, "We want you to live here." Right? And that stayed with him in his early recovery and kind of was part of what helped him see himself as worth it. Right? So it's amazing how powerful those interactions and those moments can be if we can see it that way. So really, I want to just summarize a couple of key things. You're talking about when you really understand the biology of addiction, there's no such thing as choice. When a person's in it, the idea of why are you choosing to continue to use despite these negative consequences, choice is not in the realm of consciousness. That is the thing that's compromised, right? The person's functioning. Even Daniel's story around, he's still able to function, but there's still a compromised nature around. There's something in his survival brain that's saying, and continue to use, right, on a daily basis. You and Jacob, right? I have to keep functioning. I got to keep performing in the world. So I, even after this overdose, I still got to go home and face the day and make it work. So that next use becomes the survival brain votes for the next choice. Yeah. And, so understanding that hijack, and then there's pathways, multiple pathways, and harm reduction is something that can be so simplified. We can know that many people will die in motor vehicle accidents. Harm reduction we wouldn't say, well, everyone should stop driving. You'd say, well, okay, let's be careful. Let's have laws in the road and everyone wear seatbelts. Take some defensive driving courses, know how to drive safely. So harm reduction is really know how to use safely. Right? Can we reduce the spread of HIV? Can you use clean needles? Can you go slow and take a tester? Try not to use it alone, like Andrew did, the lifeguard app, saved his life. Right? Opioid agonist treatment. There are many pathways that can support people in staying alive, and also pathways to support people towards better health outcomes and living lives where, someone's put in the chat, where the opposite of addiction is connection. Like, and Daniel was saying, well, why do you keep relapsing? What is it giving you? What are you needing from it? How else can you get those needs met in the world meaningfully and sustainably? Right? So, and that's what all of our other systems of care are for. Thanks, Andrew, for putting that story in the chat, as well as some good things to check out. So I want to open it up to questions. We've got a list of questions here from courtesy of Tricia and her colleagues, but I do want to open it up to the people who are here and have joined us live here. And I see that Tricia was saying to me that she would love to hear you speak again to more paramedics. Yeah. So any questions from anyone who's here that would like to share? I'm going to put it on gallery view. So if you have your hand up or want to put anything in the chat. And if not, I will go to our questions.
While you're pulling those up, George,
Yeah.
Can I throw out my thank you too?
Sure.
I was vaccinated by a firefighter. So that was awesome. It was my second shot. It was super amazing and yay, even though I try not to talk about COVID too much. but yeah, that was excellent. And I have to say there's no other docs on this call, but if you ever do have an opportunity to spend some time with our first responder colleagues, do so. I frankly have no idea what you do. When I was a resident, I did a ride along. I did my residency in Alberta, and I did a ride along, and you guys do stuff in the middle of such chaos. And stuff is moving, and I was blown away, and have so much massive respect for the work that you do in the chaotic real world settings that you do it in, and fully recognize that so much of my work is done in this very like clean environment that's been set up by nursing colleagues and what have you. So thank you for being that step and that liaison from out there to in here where I work. And as a physician who has a lot of patients with opiate use disorder, thank you for many times saving the lives of my patients. Because let me tell you, what I wouldn't do to go through just even 1 month to start and not hear about someone on our list dying. So we know the work that you do. We don't tend to interact with you guys a lot, but we hear about it through our patients. So thank you.
Before I go to this list of questions here, I might even give, if Daniel, Andrew, Jacob, if any of you would like to respond to anything you're hearing from either each other or Dr. Vipler, just things that are occurring to you to riff off of or share.
That word choice that's been mentioned a few times is a complicated one, and I think the reason that we resist it is because it's a bit reductive. It's quite reductive when it talks about a person's experience with addiction and substance use. I think it comes from the perspective where it's been used in the past in a way that makes that people are suggesting, well, just choose not to use. Just don't. Just stop using. And so we want to make it real simple, but we're not taking into consideration the complexity of a person's life, their experiences, their past traumas, and the nuance of what's all brought them to that place where they're currently at. And I heard a very apt analogy that helps put this into perspective a little bit, in that when we take, if we're going to use that word, which probably it's better that we don't, but if we are, we can look at an individual like they're in the midst of a tug of war. They're in the middle and they're being tugged at on both sides. There's one side that's pulling them to stay in their addiction. And the things that would be pulling them in that direction are many and varied. It can include a lot of the things that we've talked about today. The fact that they are dependent and would go into withdrawal. The fact that they have had traumatic experiences. The fact that it's relieving pain. The fact that it's familiar and something that they are ingrained into social circles and environments and living situations in which that's just the norm and the way of doing things. And then the other side of that tug of war is the things that would be pulling them towards making some changes, pulling them into some form of recovery, getting onto opioid agonist therapy, or going to a treatment center, or seeing a counselor, or whatever varied forms recovery takes for those individuals. And it doesn't necessarily have to be abstinence oriented. But those things that are pulling them in that direction could often be very few or non-existent. Maybe a loved one, maybe a caring nurse or doctor or firefighter that they come into contact with. But for a lot of people deep in addiction, this side is loaded and it's pulling strong, and there's almost nothing pulling the other way. So I like to kind of just say, does choice exist? Well, maybe it does, but it really doesn't feel like it when you're the one in the middle and everything is pulling you that way. And to make the choice to go this way just doesn't feel like it's even on the table. And, so I've appreciated that analogy when I reflect on my own past experience and how when that word was thrown out at me, which it certainly was, I was able to step back and consider that there's maybe a lot more going on here than meets the eye.
Thank you, Daniel. Jacob?
Yeah,
And
I'll
Andrew.
say just from my own experience of being in addiction is it's really lonely. It's a very lonely thing that you're doing. Even if there's people around you, you're not talking or communicating with them with what's going on. It's like a complete isolation, and there's the feeling of human connection or having a heart to heart, or even just exposing yourself to like what's going on with you is not really that existent. And I think when I came across, first responders, that was probably the first time where it was like, hey, someone knows what's going on. It was the first time someone was like, saw me and what's happening and the pain that I'm in. And just to speak again, the time at Safe Point, it still resonates with me, waking up and then just having someone not necessarily saying, what are you doing? Just with compassion. I think about that all the time. And I went back into my loneliness. And that was my first bit of connection in probably months, was when I came out from an overdose. So I think for you guys, when you're coming into these situations, it could be the first time that you're actually connecting with that person, because they've been so alone for so long. Yeah, so I just wanted to say that.
Thank you, Jacob. Andrew?
Yeah, I would add on the question of choice. You might have heard the phrase like, what possessed you to do this? And for me, it was kind of like it takes over, and your judgment is completely gone, and you'll do something that could put you in jail for years, or something else that's really, really stupid that you would never normally do. And one friend said to me, like, you turned into a different person. And that's kind of what it's like. It's like it takes over, and it's now making the decisions, the drugs or whatever, the future feeling of being high is now making decisions for you. And it felt like it was controlling my body almost. There may be some aspect of control, and somebody may be able to talk me out of it if they got there at the right time, but I'm not going to make that call or go seek out that person. Yeah, I think that's how a lot of people end up in jail and doing crime, doing B&Es, doing all sorts of stuff, because they completely don't have any control over what they're doing, and they can't think about the consequences in that moment.
Yeah, the judgment of the mind is not as available for conscious, for consciousness, and that drive for temporary relief or pleasure, especially if there's that sense of isolation, disconnection. I'm alone, and I'm feeling, I'm living in a sense of shame about what's happening for me. And maybe the person had a sense of shame even prior to ever using, and temporarily, as Daniel described, it gave that little cocoon of bliss and that cosmic hug, right? That was an antidote to how they've been feeling. And so take that away from a person without replacing it with something, is a tall task. Then plus, I, like you, Dr. Vipler, I've seen withdrawal. That is one of the nastiest things I've ever witnessed. It's like exquisite, excruciating pain. You can tell that every cell of the person's body is just on fire with desperation. Someone likened it to if your head was held underwater for a minute, how desperate would you be to get your next breath? You'd push through family, you'd do whatever it took. So there's people who will end up doing things they would never have dreamed of doing, because of the degree of desperation, and knowing that the quickest way to turn off that pain is just one more use.
Yeah.
I remember, yeah, Jacob, I was remembering you, like there was times when, oh, I want to quit, but I just have another job to do. I just need to keep it going, and I can't deal with the crash yet.
Yeah, I could imagine. I had to save face, and when I did, it was like 2-3 weeks of just terrible torture, and it was probably a good year or so until I actually felt okay, and I actually needed to take a nap every single day for the first year of not using drugs. In the middle of the day, I was completely exhausted for the longest time, and it was a real effort to pull myself and to find some sort of energy and drink enough cups of coffee to really get my life going again. Right.
So yeah, first stage of recovery is not always that rewarding. It's like, oh my God, is this what I went through all this torture for to experience this? But the beautiful news is that, with neuroplasticity, the brain can heal. It often does heal. It just takes such a long time. So Trisha just asked an interesting question. Question from another paramedic is, when people wake up, they'll deny taking any substances for their whole interaction. How might we understand that? I have my thought and answer, but go ahead, Daniel.
Sure. Okay, so I've heard this quite commonly. Actually, last month we were doing some support with firefighters in Langley, and this same question was asked. And so it doesn't surprise me for a number of reasons. One is what we've talked about a little bit, and that's the shame narrative that exists in the mind of someone who's struggling with substance use. So that's one factor. The perception that they will be judged for their behavior, that they'll be further stigmatized. There's also probably attached to that the fear of consequences from police, not an awareness of the Good Samaritan law and the fact that they might end up having to interact with police. So that would be causing them to perhaps not want to be honest about that. But I think even the bigger factor really is just the judgment that comes along with the social stigma of being labeled an addict or labeled a drug user. And that's why I really appreciate Dr. Vipler's willingness or unwillingness to use the word addict. Like, when we throw that out so freely, it reduces complicated individuals who have lots of life experience to a one-word label that's a pejorative. It's not, it's not a positive word. It doesn't bring hope or encourage or talk about a person in a way that makes them anything more than just, a junkie, another word that we use so judgmentally and that makes people feel terrible about themselves. So any defensive mechanism I can come up with to prevent myself from being judged, I will utilize, even if it means denying what I was doing. So absolutely, I wasn't taking, I was just napping.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The denial is something fierce, isn't it? And for me, it was I didn't want someone to take away my drugs, or I didn't want this run to stop because I didn't want to face the consequences of the withdrawal. So yeah, I can definitely see myself lying. Let's say my family was around or whatever, I don't know, and I just didn't feel like I was right there to clean up or to stop using. I would definitely lie about that. So I can see that probably is common.
Yeah.
There's also going to be the tendency or the desire to avoid a lecture, right? And who knows what kind of advice is going to be coming down the pipe as soon as I admit to using and this person revives me. Now they're going to tell me I need to do this and I need to do that and go to treatment and go here. And maybe we just don't really have the patience for hearing that at the moment.
Unsolicited advice from someone where you haven't established that person gets it and gets me. Yeah. Now, Matt did put in the chat a document that I think can be really worth taking a look at. It's called After an Overdose. See if does that work when you try and click on it? When I double click on that, Matt, it comes up with something a little odd.
It's going to make it
Yeah.
save it. It's going to make you save it, I think, onto your whatever. Yeah, that's
Onto
not
something.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So you may have to do that in order to see it. So there's often a sense of like, it's been brought up often when people are brought back with naloxone, Narcan, they're not happy about it. The last thing they knew is they were seeking the effect that they were looking for from that substance. And the next thing they know, they're jolted out of that into a rude awakening. So if you imagine, there's a receptor, an opioid receptor, and there's the fentanyl that's in there, it makes that neuron fire. Naloxone is just a blade, kicks it out, sits on the top. It's like nothing else can come in. So instant withdrawal. And that nice, lovely hug that they're getting is ripped away from them. So for a lot of people, that's so jarring. It'd be like for us to be woken up with a bucket of ice cold water. We might not react so well at the beginning either. So this document is really about how to speak and a tone to take right after a person comes to that might help mitigate that. Were you going to say something, Sharon?
Oh yeah. Just around when people decline to disclose that they've been using, sometimes I have to check in with myself whether it's important for me to know. And I find them, for me, this is just my approach, that usually works the best is more of like the curiosity of, oh, it's just that when I've seen other people present in this way, it was because of an overdose, and I was worried about that being a possibility in your case. I still think it's a little bit unusual that you present it this way, and that's what I would be worried about. But it sounds like that's not something I have to worry about. So it just leaves a little bit open. Maybe people step in, maybe they won't. Kind of explaining what you're worried about, and where, if this is an overdose, let's say this was post Narcan. If this was an overdose, I have given you Narcan and you're looking way better right now. But the reason I'm worried is you might still need some help when the Narcan wears off in about an hour. And kind of really placing yourself as like, my question is not coming from a place of judgment or my ideas. My question is coming as a care provider. My job might not be done here. And so kind of explaining the why behind the question can sometimes allow for a conversation that perhaps wouldn't have occurred. Sometimes, yeah.
In the past, I've had it explained to me where they just simply say, if you are using within the next 30, 40 minutes when the Narcan wears off, there's a chance you'll overdose. So that was kind of like I thought that was a kind of a decent way to talk to me about it. Just explaining that, but.
Yeah, exactly.
There's another couple of questions that were given around beyond being kind and compassionate and that kind of wisdom that Jacob just offered. Is there anything else that would be helpful to say as a first responder to someone who's just come back from an overdose or is in the ambulance on the way to hospital? What would be needed to be heard at a time like that? Andrew?
When they just come back, maybe welcome back, something like that.
Very simple. Yeah, and meaning it, right? Yeah. I think like Jacob's experience too, like having this sense of, we're glad you're here. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, welcome back is such a succinct way of doing that, Andrew. Jacob?
Yeah, I mean, just for me, I know I touched on this before, just the loneliness, and you're waking up to these people, and yeah, just to have the feeling that someone is in your corner especially if you're going to the hospital where, I mean, we've seen the slides, a lot of people are having bad experiences. So just to have someone in your corner as you're heading to the hospital say, welcome back. I hope you're doing okay. You're going to the hospital. This is what's going to happen. And just kind of like the friendliness. To be honest, like I got a hug when I came out, so it was a pretty good experience. So I haven't had a bad experience with that, but just feeling like people are on your side, in your corner, and not against you and judging you.
Yes, and that might sound very obvious, just don't judge people, but I have been to see a client of mine in the hospital when the doctor came in, and the first words were, "Well, I see you haven't learned from the last times, huh?" Right away. And so this person who's already exquisitely sensitized to shame just got it dumped on her, right? As though she was choosing to harm herself. Yeah. So it may sound simple to avoid those things, but yeah. Daniel?
Well, I just also want to add that we shouldn't automatically assume that the person we're helping has a substance use disorder at all.
For sure.
Large percentage of overdoses are happening in private residences. Many of the people that I've known that have died certainly did not have substance disorders. They used very occasionally, and the vast majority of people are fully capable of doing that, being responsible with their drug use of all kinds. So, unfortunately, with the toxic drug supply, those people that I know that might have occasionally used cocaine or ecstasy or drugs like that are now at risk of, fentanyl entering those drugs and overdosing in a way that they never used to be. But the overdose crisis is constantly conflated with being hand in hand with addiction. And I don't know that that's helpful necessarily, and automatically assuming that the person who overdosed has an addiction issue is probably going to mean that you're going to say something that might not be helpful. So if you just assume it's just an overdose because a person accidentally poisoned themselves because they took a drug that they didn't know what was in it, and that's the approach that we come at this from, then we're responding to someone who shouldn't have overdosed in the first place, and we can have a more positive outlook on them. And that leads into another conversation which I'm passionate about, involving drug policy and drug law reform and the changes that do need to happen in this country in order to bring an end to the overdose crisis. So that's the next webinar.
I want to be on that one too. Invite me, please. I think the other piece, I don't know where I learned this from, someone far wiser than me, but it's my go-to now, is just remembering that there are some very basic human needs. And so when I have a patient now that perhaps a resident of mine is seeing, and they come in and they're all flustered and they don't want to talk to me, I'm like, why don't you go see if he's hungry, see if he wants a sandwich or a glass of water, or is he uncomfortable in his bed? So even on the scene, looking to see how the patient's lying, is their shoulder in a funny location, and being like, hey, bud, your shoulder looks uncomfortable. Can I help you with that? It just, rather than a memorizing a kind phrase, it's just what does this human being need right now to be comfortable? Hey, your head's kind of sitting in a funny way. Can I help you move that? Do you need you look a bit chilly because they'll be shaking. Can I give you a blanket? And nobody kind of teaches that in medical school, or I think fireman school or paramedic school, fire person school or paramedic school. They teach us interventions, right? They're like, walk in, here's the algorithm, do this. Then we're interventionalists, and no one says, take a breath and see if the dude wants a sandwich, or take a breath and see if they need a blanket. But it's so much more powerful than so much of the stuff that we do. So I don't know.
Human care rather than our professional lens always.
Yeah.
The human being in front of me who's going through something, what might they need to feel comfortable? It's an interesting question to ask ourselves. I'm aware that there's 22 questions that Trisha threw at me, and there's no way we'll get to them all. They're great. There's a question here around, are there options for alcoholics or people who are experiencing alcohol use disorder, and how do those options work? I don't know if you want to take that one, Dr. Vipler, or I could certainly, as the community-based substance use services, I could just talk about some options for alcohol. I mean,
Yeah, it's a little bit hard to answer because I don't know what the intent is behind the question. Like, is it when you find someone so intoxicated and they're difficult to redirect? Is it withdrawal? Is it what options exist for people with alcohol use disorder? So I'll choose to answer the.
There's Trisha that's going to clarify.
Dr. Vipper, it was just that we're talking a lot about the opioid crisis, and we're still seeing the alcohol crisis that's kind of the hidden secret that we all have. And they were just wondering, is anything being forgotten? Is there something that we can recommend, is what the employee was asking.
Oh, thank goodness, because that's the easiest one out of the three options I put forward.
Yes.
So yes, absolutely, 100 times, 1,000 times yes. So in Fraser Health, we have rapid access clinics, rapid access to addiction care clinics. There's one in Surrey, there's one in New West, and soonish there will be one in Fraser East. And so anybody can come through Monday through Friday if they have any concerns with any substance use, including alcohol. And in fact, I worked this morning at one of them, and all but one case was alcohol. And there are actually medications that can help people manage alcohol use disorder that, you know, depending on their complexity of their use disorder, we can have them stabilize in the community. And this is not something we did before. But before, the answer was always detox, right? Which is certainly a limited resource. So George, actually, I can put it in the chat, the RAC information.
Sure.
So,
I would also add that every community has a community substance use services. So Sources in South Surrey White Rock is the kind of the door that a person can walk through to get access to the larger continuum of care. So even if the person isn't certain that they may want to change their relationship with alcohol, as long as they're willing to talk about it. We use a very motivational interviewing, kind of meet people where they're at approach, the biopsychosocial spiritual model. So we have clinical counselors here. We have run groups, mindfulness-based relapse prevention groups, how to manage depression and anxiety and early recovery. So all kinds of things like that. We can certainly connect people to residential treatment if that's what they want. There are new day and evening and weekend programs. There's brand new one in Surrey. That's fantastic. And Creekside is still our go-to for withdrawal management. It's a good 2 to 3 weeks to get in still for the average person calling. We got a guy just today, he's consuming a 26er a day, and he's gonna manage that until he can get into Creekside. So our pathways, there's also smart recovery, self-help movement, support groups in South Surrey White Rock. And if you're interested in the 12 steps at all, you can go to 5 meetings a day, every day in White Rock. White Rock has the most number of Alcoholics Anonymous meetings per capita in Canada.
Oh, that's an addiction too, though. That's right.
Hey now. Many paths.
I'm just teasing.
Yeah.
Hey, George,
Thanks
I was
for the
wondering if I can
mention.
answer one of these questions that's here. I just found interesting.
Yes.
The list. How can we promote recovery? Bit of an interesting question. And again, it's one of those questions that I don't know entirely what the motivation was, but I just saw it and I latched onto it. And I felt like I would say that recovery doesn't really need to be promoted. I don't even know what a person means when they say recovery. You should get into recovery. Do you mean you should be abstinent? You should never use drugs ever again? Do you mean you should go to a treatment center? Do you mean you should call George and get some counseling over at Sources? There's many paths, and one like you just said, George, many paths, which can include 5 AA meetings a day for some people. One of the things that's almost never talked about when we talk about addiction is that the vast majority of individuals overcome their addictions without any help whatsoever. They don't go to counseling. They don't go to treatment. They don't do 12 steps. They just literally, for lack of a better way of putting it, grow out of it or mature out. And this is most people's experience. And when I'm in rooms with like slightly older crowds, I'll often say, you know, how many people here can look back at their younger years and there was some problematic substance use going on for you? Maybe you were drinking too much, or maybe you were experimenting with drugs and it was starting to create some problems in your life. And how many of you just ended up growing out of that phase without doing anything to really intentionally address it? And that's actually the experience of most people. And so I think that that's a really important thing to consider, that perhaps I reflect on my own past. Had there been a little more of a support in recognizing that, you know, maybe we don't have to go the traditional method. Maybe we don't have to require treatment center. Might have opened the door to some alternative approaches. And that's where harm reduction can play a role. You know, I'm just speculating, but what if somebody had said to me, hey, let's just maybe not do quite as much heroin. Let's try and why don't we just smoke some weed for a bit, and let's see. Who knows? Yeah. But I'm just saying, I want people to think outside the box. I want people to try other methods. I mean, there's new research into psychedelics where these are helping people overcome addictions. And, you know, we need to embrace creative thinking around this stuff. And Dr. Vipler talked about the dopamine hit that you get off nicotine, which is even higher.
Daniel, sorry to interrupt. I just want to mark before he has to run off. He's got to go.
Okay.
Just quickly share something with the group while this is being recorded.
Okay, thanks, George. I wanted to ask you for something. I don't know if any of you know about the Second Responder Program. It's about 18 months old right now. It's a partnership with Fire and Fraser Health's Substance Use Services Access Team, where we track overdoses in residents. As you mentioned, Daniel, that's a super high risk. And we specifically go back a day or 2 or 3 after the overdose event with a clinician from Fraser Health, part of the SUSAT team, and we bring along a peer with lived or living experience as a kind of a liaison to address the issues that we've been talking about, the stigmatism, the difficulty negotiating through protocols at hospital, issues relating to justice system, unemployment, all things we identified at our 2019 opioid summit in Surrey. And so what I wanted to ask you, and maybe we need to do this again, the panel and whoever's interested, to talk about, we've talked a lot about what that first experience is like, but I'd love to hear from you. What would the ultimate second experience be like? I as a firefighter for 20 years, I despaired at revisiting the same patient twice on the same day, joining this profession, wanting to help people and seeing something's not working, right? So now I have a chief's job and I have this opportunity to do some work. Like fire prevention is what I do. Health prevention is natural for me. It's great that we can help with naloxone, but what if we could help with the underlying problem? So how do we connect individuals with that pathway? Again, as Daniel said, we're not trying to push abstinence. We're trying to push harm reduction. We're trying to provide support to come back and say, hey, we actually do care. We want to see how you made out because we know you had a difficult day the other day we were here. So yeah, I'd love to. I mean, obviously SUSAT's involved and I trust their judgment and professional experience, but I'd love to hear from you guys too. Help me understand what it should feel like when we come back. So maybe through George, I'm going to reach out to you, George, and we'll see if we can coordinate that together.
Well, yes.
I'm in trouble now. Sorry, I really got to go.
Mark.
Thanks, you guys.
Bye. Sorry, Daniel.
No, that's okay.
Yeah, I knew that he had a quick thing to share there.
Yeah, I realize we're at time too, and I have to get to my next thing as well. But
right.
Yeah, I think that my thought was more or less complete anyway.
My sense too is, if nothing else, conveying that I see you, and I see you as worthwhile. You're a worthy human being, and I see you. Right? Just being able to convey that is powerful for someone who might have felt lonely, right, Jacob? It's someone who might have felt marginalized or unable to connect in a way that felt meaningful. So rather than that chemical hug, right, that pseudo comfort, you know, to just receive that in-person comfort and warmth. I think that's what so many people are needing in order to even say, to me, recovery means being able to come back into community in some way, right? So one of the ways I think about Mark's invitation there is we do have a grant to start a peer support network with some outreach and system navigation. So I'm hoping that we can create a community that can bring something more than just bringing a person back. But of course, without bringing the person back, there's no community to offer. So I'm mindful of time and that people have to run off. Thank you for everyone who was able to be here today. I really want to thank Daniel, Andrew, Jacob. This was very, very, very powerful, and I just feel so inspired by the three of you. And I think what you've managed to share today will resonate for many people who are going to watch this recording. So your words will have ripple effects. So thank you very much to you.
Thanks for having us. Yeah.
You bet. You bet.
Thank you.
And thank you again, Tricia, and to everyone who does what you do out there. Like I feel very blessed to be a part of this community of people who care. So it's not the case everywhere. Yeah. So thank you very much. And with that, take care, everybody.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.